Howdy doody everybody, and welcome back to my journey across the United States. Today we're visiting Indiana's weird folklore, and it seems there's no normal corner left in this place. Now, Indiana, do you want to know a fun fact? You were my first video to get 1,000 views, and for that, I will forever be grateful to you. Also, hey, see this video on the screen? I recently ran one of your half marathons in Indianapolis. Anyways, thanks for everything, folks, and just a quick reminder, if you want to see my little channel succeed out here, all I ask is a like, a subscription, and a comment, and for you to watch until the end. This will never cost you a dime, and it's a quick way to say, hey YouTube, this guy's alright. Anyways, with this in mind, let's get into the video. The Mill Race Monster was seen in Columbus, Indiana in 1974, and it ended up launching the largest monster hunt in U.S. history. This monster was described as bipedal and between 6 and 7 feet tall, with a mossy green appearance. It was first sighted on November 1st of 1974 when police in Columbus got reports from at least 2 sets of eyewitnesses that apparently saw and might have even been chased by a green-skinned monster near water at Mill Race Park. The first report was at about 3 p.m. when 4 young women saw the monster between 2 trees in the park. These women got away and called the police, reporting a green, hairy, and large creature. The second report involved 2 women who were separate from our first group. One of these women, Terre, came forward in 2015 on the show Monsters and Mysteries in America, 41 years later, and supported that she saw something that was not someone wearing a costume. She was certain about this. She noted that this creature had some sort of slime on its face, that it had large claws, and that it kind of attacked her, scratching her and leaving behind a strange smell on her. Now, after this supposed attack, news spread about this monster. And on November 2nd of 1974, a newspaper named The Republic printed a story titled, "Monster, Women Report Seeing Beast in Mill Race," which talked about these encounters. Another news report on November 6th described another account by 2 20-year-old men calling the creature the Mill Race Monster for the first time. Following this, on November 9th of 1974, the Indianapolis Star described a 4th encounter between 2 city dog catchers, Rick Duckworth, which is an awesome name, and John Brown, who claimed they chased the monster after it ran from them. In this account, they legitimately thought this was actually simply a man that was tall and wearing a green mask and green blankets. This report garnered popularity and led many amateur monster hunters to go to the region, or should I say the park, with one notable night where 100 cars were parked at the park because people wanted to catch the monster. It was just an influx of crazy people like me that probably have way too much time on their hands to talk about monsters and go looking for them. In this specific instance, law enforcement actually had to respond, and the city closed the park at night after this, stationing police there in fear that the public would get hurt, seeing as droves of them were flocking there to look for a monster, and some of them may have even been armed. Funny enough, this resulted in one Columbus Police Department officer, Kenneth John, as their official monster control officer. Now, the Mill Race Monster hasn't really been seen much since this response by the police force, posting someone out in front of the park to keep people away at night. There are some people that have come forward saying they'd seen the creature after notable individuals from this original case came forward, and they made some noise about the case again. This happened, for instance, after Terre had her story run on Fox News, but in my eyes, this maybe feels a little bit like clout chasing. There are also some hunters in the region that have claimed to see Bigfoot in the nearby Morgan Monroe State Forest, about an hour's drive from Mill Race Park, and some conflate Bigfoot-type creatures with this beast because of this. It's worth noting, Bigfoot isn't typically described as playing in water or being green and covered in slime, but a Bigfoot-type beast covered in algae or pond scum may very well be green and slimy. This also isn't the first semi-aquatic Sasquatch we've seen on this channel, and if you remember back to our Ohio's Cryptids video, there was an aquatic Bigfoot-like creature in that video. And let's be clear, the setting for that is not so far from this one. Maybe Midwest Bigfoot subspecies just like water, who knows? Ultimately, though, the prevailing opinion on this case is that it was probably a hoax, And one man, a retired police officer named Dennis Nolf, even came forward in 2015, and he claimed that a young man came to him after the initial rash of sightings and admitted to playing the part of the monster by wearing a costume and submerging himself in a river to get the monster's dripping, slimy appearance. Of course, this account is scarcely included in programs seeking to document or sensationalize the mill race monster, though. Anyways, let me know what you think. Is this aquatic Sasquatch variant real? Is he slimy? Is he stinky? Let me know if you've seen him in the comments below. So I actually covered this topic in my original video on Indiana. It's kind of a ghost story and also kind of an urban legend, depending on who you hear it from. But I think it's more urban legend than ghost story, and it's certainly weird, so screw it, it's going in here. In short, near Brazil, Indiana, the home of David Goggins, is what's said to be the state's most haunted cemetery. And here, in a cemetery sometimes referred to as 100 Step Cemetery, if you take a walk around, you'll find a pretty decent-sized staircase that leads up to the top of a hill that overlooks a nearby road. The history of this place is that it was established around the American Civil War, and here I would be absolutely amazed if you could guess the number of steps that are in a 100-step cemetery that you need to climb to reach the top. Need a second, maybe two? Yeah, it's just 100 steps. Now there's a caveat apparently at 100 Step Cemetery. The steps these days are partially buried at this point. And in part due to the popularity of the cemetery and also the associated liability of partially buried stairs, new stairs have been installed so that it's easier to walk to the top. Anyways, regarding the urban legend surrounding the stairs, it's said that if you ascend the steps, counting while you do it at midnight under a moonless sky, and then you descend, counting the number of steps once again, you'll count a different number of steps going up and down. That's at least the first myth about the cemetery. The second urban legend associated with the cemetery is actually the scarier one, and this one simply states that if you ascend the steps and look back down, you'll see the ghost of an old caretaker at the cemetery, which will reveal to you the way you die. Then you must descend again. You have to count both up and down, by the way. If the number you counted while going up and down were the same, the vision was a lie. But if there's a mismatch between the two, well, you just saw how you'll die. Even worse, if you leave the path or don't count, you'll apparently be pushed to the ground by the spirit. Or maybe that's actually better. Actually, yeah, I'd pretty much rather be pushed over than confront the vision of my death, now that I think about it. Now, little do most know, there's also a third urban legend. See, it's said, while going through his epic winter arc, old Goggins himself ran up and down these stairs, seeing visions of his death the whole way, and this is why he's able to stay so hard. It's said that because of that, if you count your steps while walking to the top and your final number is 69,420, you'll hear a ghost whisper in your ear, and the next time you blink, you'll open your eyes to see Goggins in front of you. Of course, this one's just a joke, right? There's no such thing as In the front lawn of the Indiana State House, there are many trees, and they are all special in their own way, I'm sure, but one tree in particular is, well, far more interesting than the rest. It's a sycamore tree that was planted a few decades ago, and it was grown from a seed that went on a little trip. Now, there are plenty of invasive species in this world. If you've ever gone through customs, you'll know that bringing seeds across international borders is very against the rules. But this tree, man, its seed did far more than that. It took a ride on Apollo 14. It went to the moon and back in 1971. The story behind this is the command module pilot on Apollo 14, Stuart A. Roosa, who decided to bring about 500 seeds with him on the Apollo 14 flight, perhaps influenced by his work in forestry in its youth. Upon returning from space, he doled out many of these seeds to state forestry associations throughout the 1970s to mark the USA's bicentennial. While there are about 50 actual, quote-unquote, moon trees alive and well in the USA, this one is the first I've come across on my journey across the USA, but there are a few more scattered throughout Indiana, such as in Lincoln City, Tell City, and in Cannelton. As far as I can tell, this tree is pretty much a normal tree. Scientists have studied it and everything, and as far as they can tell, these trees whose seeds germinated in space remain exactly like their Earth-germinated counterparts. In Indiana, specifically around Michigan City, there's reports of a unique sort of creature. Now, if you've watched my previous videos, you'll well know that reports of humanoid, although non-human critters, are abundant throughout the USA. Some notable inclusions among this group being the enigmatic pukwudgie of New England, and I guess also Indiana, although the Indiana pukwudgie isn't going to be covered in this video. Additionally, the elusive Bigfoot is one of these creatures. I preface with this because I wonder if perhaps what we're about to talk about is actually one of those creature categories, but regardless is acknowledged as its own sort of creature. Regardless, we're here to talk about Michigan City's wild child. In 1839, a Michigan City newspaper reported something kind of strange, an approximately 4-foot-tall humanoid creature covered in light brown hair that was apparently seen by multiple locals roaming the hills of the area. This article referred to it as a wild child. Apparently some locals pursued whatever this critter was, as it was noted to run away from those who went after it with inhuman velocity. The article also noted that occasionally it seemed to almost try to speak to people, but instead made, I quote, frightful and hideous yells. Most commonly, the wild child was seen along the shores of Lake Michigan in the summer months, looking for fish and frogs to feast on. Apparently, in pursuit of this prey, the wild child could even swim, and apparently it was very fast when it did so. Also, in case you've settled on the idea that the wild child was a lone human youth running amok in Michigan City in summer of 1839, and the child probably died in the winter, I have a little more information for you. In 1840, in Elkhart County, there was again something strange happening. There were reports of livestock being killed, with the culprit similarly being some man-like beast. The way the news articles were being framed, it seemed like the old wild child may have just grown up a bit. This wasn't the end of the wild child saga either. In 1860, yet another report of a wild child was swirling around in Plymouth, Indiana. This report even garnered a search party of 300 people to search for a child estimated to be between the age range of 7 and 10, who was sighted in the region multiple times. I should note, in this case at least, it doesn't seem that the child was noted to be hairy, nor was he involved with any livestock misadventures. I'd sadly venture to guess this incident may have just been a real lost child or maybe a runaway. Now, it's worth noting, this all occurred well before the Patterson-Gimlin films sensationalized the topic of Bigfoot, and the newspaper speaking about this wild child in the first 1839 article actually hypothesized, despite saying the child was extremely hairy, that most probably the wild child was an immigrant child who wandered away from its family or was stolen by natives, but regardless found its way into the woods. And rather than being raised by humans, it was raised by the forest and the animals within it. In short, they thought whatever this was, it wasn't a beast, but was rather a juvenile human. And the article even thought they should try to capture the young man and reintroduce him to society. I am thinking about a sitcom with young Bigfoot trying to go to high school now, but anyways, I digress. Now, regardless, I don't know about you, but generally when I spend more time in the woods, I don't end up any hairier. Also, it would be an absolute miracle for a lone child to survive even the mildest of northern Indiana winters. In short, while this may very well have been a human, I don't buy the interpretation of this newspaper. I'm not saying that in 1839 Michigan City saw a baby Bigfoot, just that the wild child was probably either not real or was not human, and I don't know what the heck lies between those 2 points if it wasn't one of those, so color me unsure here. But let me know what you think. Was this a baby Bigfoot? Was it just what happens to Hoosiers when they eat too much red meat? I don't know, just let me know. For those of us privy to the current college football playoffs, we're probably all too familiar with the term Hoosier. But seriously, if you're not from Indiana, you might be asking, what is a Hoosier? Where does the word come from? And what exactly should I do if someone calls me a Hoosier? Should I punch them? Well, to start, probably don't punch them, but regarding the history of the term Hoosier, it began being used around the 1830s, and one of its first mentions in media is in a poem by one John Finley called The Hoosier's Nest. In this poem, he actually originally spelled the word Hoosier as in Hoosher. Shortly after this, the term Hoosier State was used when offering Indiana residents a toast at the Jackson Day Dinner in Indianapolis in 1833. Not long after that, the former Indiana governor, James B. Ray, announced the creation of a newspaper, the Hoosier, this time spelled Hoosier, in Greencastle, Indiana. There is also substantial evidence that the term Hoosier was used in language before this, but was never actually written down in substantive media. Now, as for what Hoosier means, well, it's pretty clear. It means to refer to an inhabitant of Indiana, and from what I can tell, it's a title both used as an insult and worn with pride in equal measure. If you're a resident of Indiana, you might proudly refer to yourself as a Hoosier, for instance. But someone might also call you a Hoosier in a bout of angst, at which point you should punch them. This isn't actually situational advice, that's just a joke, I promise. So finally, where did the term Hoosier come from? Well, as with all things oral history, it's not entirely clear. But there are a few theories I read pertaining to this. The first one is it's said when a visitor hailed a pioneer cabin in Indiana or knocked on its door, the local would respond, "Who's yere?" Admittedly, I don't know why this wouldn't have happened in adjacent states, but I digress. Number two, it's said that the rivermen of Indiana were basically really good at fighting, and became known as hushers because their fists would shut people up. End of story. Number three, there was a contractor named Hoosier, that was his last name, employed in Louisville, and he preferred to hire Indiana locals, and therefore his men were called Hoosiers. Number 4, the Hoosier poet James Whitcomb Riley claims that it originated from the tradition of terrible brawls in early Indiana. Apparently people would scratch and bite and tear, and sometimes an ear would come off. The next morning, apparently some would come out to the local tavern only to look down and see an ear on the ground, and then they would ask, "Whose ear?" Admittedly, I'm not sure I'm convinced by any of these explanations. Perhaps number 1 and number 3 with the Whose Year and Indiana Contractor are the most convincing to me. Despite this, Hoosiers, I wish you the best this upcoming CFP season, which should be starting the day I make this video. I think you're even playing on Friday, so good luck out there. May the odds be ever in your favor, Hoosiers. Often, true crime is interesting and strange to me because of the strange compulsions of the perpetrators, the confusing and often misleading trail of breadcrumbs left behind by criminals and supposed witnesses, and the various twists that investigators are taken through and their direction to solve a case. But in this case, that of the Burger Chef murders, a somewhat bewildering series of decisions by law enforcement led what may have been a case that was easy to solve to remain a cold case, even after 4 decades. Now, to give you some context, Burger Chef was a fast food chain that began operating in the 1950s in Indianapolis, and it expanded far and wide throughout the USA and Canada by the 1970s, though as of 1996, the company was no longer in operation. In this story, the Burger Chef restaurant in question was the one in Speedway, Indiana, at 5725 Crawfordsville Road. The date was November 17th of 1978, and 4 employees were working. Jane Freet, the assistant manager, who was 20, Daniel David, a 16-year-old employee, Mark Flemons, another 16-year-old employee, and Ruth Ellen Shelton, a 17-year-old employee. This saga begins when a fellow employee decided to swing by this evening, and in a strange turn of events, found the restaurant to be empty, with the safe open and the back restaurant door open as well. This individual, of course, phoned the police, who, upon arrival just after midnight, found the manager's office to be in disarray, and that $581 was missing in cash from the safe. Additionally, the car of the individuals working there, the assistant manager Jane Freet, the 20-year-old, was no longer on site. The presumption by police here was frankly alarming to me. The police presumed that the workers simply stole the money and made the restaurant appear like it had been robbed. Again, let this soak in. To the police, it appeared the restaurant had been robbed, but they decided that it must have been staged by the employees rather than an actual robbery because there was no sign of a struggle. They say this despite the fact that the manager's office was in disarray, which to me indicates a sign of a struggle. And yep, they simply concluded the children must have taken the money to go party. This is all despite the fact that the purses and jackets of the women working at this Speedway burger chef were left in the restaurant despite it being November. This conclusion to me is nothing short of laziness and stupidity of the highest degree. Now, upon this conclusion, they literally told the fellow employees that would open the next morning that nothing was awry and to simply clean the scene up the next morning. The police didn't even take photographs. New individuals were allowed on site the next morning, and customers were even allowed inside. If there was any evidence of a crime scene here in the first place, it was eliminated at this point, and it was essentially the choice of the police to eliminate it. This, my friends, is how you craft a cold case. Now, regardless, as you may expect, the four were not out partying, as they did not suddenly appear the next morning. Big shocker. Additionally, the assistant manager's car, a Chevy Vega, was found parked a few blocks away from the Speedway Police Department. This is, interesting to me. I'll just leave it there. But despite this, at this point, it finally appeared to the police that the youth had probably been abducted rather than going on a shopping spree with $581. Of course, to no surprise, 2 days later, the fate of the involved party was determined, as on November 19th, the bodies of the four individuals were all found by a couple walking on their property off of Stones Crossing Road in White River Township, Indiana. The teens had been shot, stabbed, and bludgeoned, and on their persons was plenty of cash and valuables, such as watches, implying that these murders didn't have anything to do with robbery, or possibly that this episode was due to a botched robbery with one victim recognizing the perpetrator of the crime. This, of course, led multiple police agencies to arrive on scene, and there was a press conference where the then county prosecutor didn't even let the actual police answer many questions. It seems he was furious with them, but who knows. This all led to a multi-agency investigation beginning the next day and a $25,000 reward being offered for information that led to arrests. Additionally, a 16-year-old eyewitness apparently saw suspicious men in a car outside of Burger Chef before closing. 2 white men, estimated to be in their 30s. Police had sketches made of these 2 individuals and released them on November 22nd. And on November 24th, clay busts of these suspects were made. From here, I should note things got finicky, and not for a short while, for literal years. Some individuals were considered suspects and cleared. Anonymous letter writers to newspapers gave damning accounts, even stating that there were more than 2 killers involved in the murders, and individuals involved in similar crimes were held and questioned. All of this to no avail in terms of finding the culprits involved in this case. Heck, on the approximate 1-year anniversary of the case, on November 15th, the state police superintendent came out and did all but admit there were no suspects or new knowledge related to this crime. To be clear, the handling of the contemporary suspects just appeared very, very poor to me. For instance, a man from Greenwood apparently bragged about the murders in the bar. He was picked up by police, but denied the claims and passed a polygraph. There wasn't any evidence, perhaps because they had teenagers clean up the crime scene, and the man was released. There was also a person of interest identified who apparently looked a lot like one of the men cited by the teenager in the car, one of the 30-year-olds. He had a beard, and this was one of his notable features. The police ensured that this man would show up to a lineup, and of course, the night before this lineup, where he may have been picked out, he shaved his beard. It's worth noting this individual did confide in his son later in life that he was indeed involved in the crime before his death, but again, this is pretty useless information to us as they couldn't have made an arrest in his life. Also, there was an individual involved in this case who went to prison for armed robbery of another fast food restaurant. But of course, connecting this individual to the Burger Chef incident was essentially impossible without a direct confession because the police let the crime scene get contaminated. Again, it was cleaned up by teenagers. Thus, the murders couldn't have been pinned on him even if he did it. Now, for what it's worth, there is one individual who I'm willing to say was almost certainly directly involved in this case, one Donald Forrester. regardless of the fact that no arrests had been made in regards to the Burger Chef case. By 1984, Forrester had managed to become an inmate at the Pendleton Correctional Facility anyways, and upon learning he was soon to be transferred to a more violent state penitentiary, he opted to confess to these murders to avoid this transfer. Now, if we know anything about inmates, we know that confessions should be taken with a grain of salt. If you're going to be locked up in prison for a long time anyways, a confession can often result in little to no change in your sentencing. But it can be used as a bargaining chip to get what you want or need from the government, as we're seeing in this case. Despite this, Forrester not only confessed to being the one to shoot 2 of the Burger Chef employees, but he also led police directly to the true crime scene, where he was recounted to have accurately described the location and positions of the victims. He also knew a scarcely publicized detail, that he broke off the handle of the knife in one of the victims only for it to be found during the autopsy. He even gave police details regarding why this crime occurred. Apparently Freet, the assistant manager, had a brother that owed money to Forrester on a drug deal. Hoping to get this money, Forrester and 3 others went to intimidate her, but 16-year-old Mark Flemons tried to intervene to protect Freet, resulting in a fight during which Flemons fell and received head trauma from his landing headfirst on the bumper of a car in the parking lot. Forrester and his accomplices thought Flemons had died from this head trauma, and from there they decided to do the job, so to speak. As part of this confession, Flemons even led the police to a spot where he claimed to have ditched his firearm into the river, although this firearm was never actually found. The police even interviewed Forrester's ex-wife, who mentioned he'd driven with her to a wooded area after the murders took place, and they retrieved shell casings, which they flushed down the toilet at home. Searching the home's septic tank, they actually found .38 caliber shell casings, which would be quite the coincidence if he wasn't actually involved in this case. Anyways, it looked like these murders were going to be pinned on Forrester, but then someone at the sheriff's office leaked details of Forrester's cooperation, and suddenly Forrester recanted everything and claimed that he was not involved and that his confession was coerced. Forrester was never charged and went on to die in prison in 2006. If you can't tell, this is basically where the story is. There are many more details I could share about this case in a longer video if you wanted. Heck, I could probably cover this case for an hour or more in a focused episode. But as of now, this case is open and officially unsolved by the Indiana State Police. In Terre, Haute, Indiana, a place I saw described on YouTube as Indiana's left armpit, which I think is pretty rude, there's something a little bit odd. This something dwells in the Vigo County Historical Society Museum, and it's a dog that, well, rather than being skin and bone like my dog, is actually made of cement. He's kind of eerie looking, to be honest, probably in part due to the fact that his left eye is shattered, so he looks at you with one shattered eye and one green eye. Honestly, the dog sort of looks imposing anyways, and if you threw an eye patch on him, he might look a little bit like Nick Fury. Regardless, this dog is referred to as Stiffy Green, and while the truth about him, according to the folks at the Historical Society, is kind of boring, the legend behind the cement dog and his real-life lookalike is both macabre and sort of sweet. As the legend goes, in Terre Haute, in 1921, someone passed away. The owner of a bulldog named Stiffy, who was named John Heinel. Stiffy was of course a good boy, and didn't want to leave his owner behind after his owner was placed inside of a mausoleum in Highland Lawn Cemetery. And it was common for old Stiffy to run away from home, only to sit behind his owner's mausoleum. Apparently while staying there, he would growl and bark at anyone who visited John's grave, and he would defend his old owner loyally. Sadly though, one day Stiffy ran away, and the next time he was seen, he was deceased outside of the mausoleum. In honor of his devotion to his owner, the dog was supposedly stuffed, and his green eyes were replaced with green glass replicas, and this stuffed dog was placed inside of the mausoleum next to his beloved owner. Now, of course, word spread about this odd stuffed dog in a cemetery, and it became a frequent pastime for local youth to visit old Stiffy at night and shine a flashlight inside of the mausoleum to see the eyes sparkle green. There were even rumors circling that John and Stiffy would still go for ghostly walks around the cemetery together. But this isn't the ghosts video in Indiana, so we'll get to that in due time. Apparently, at one point, some vandals ended up firing a weapon at poor Stiffy, actually hitting him in one of his eyes, good aim, actually causing this one broken eye I've talked about. After this incident, poor Stiffy was removed from the mausoleum to protect him, and he was donated to the Historical Society, where he's been since 1989, or maybe 1983, according to one source I found. So let's be clear, the Historical Society's stance here is that Stiffy was never a real dog, but was rather a lawn ornament made of cement that was owned by John, which he wanted placed within his mausoleum. They do not believe that Stiffy was ever a real dog, but ask residents of Terre, Haute, and they'll tell you a different story, that Stiffy was indeed real and loyal, and at one point not made of cement, but rather a real dog, and then a stuffed dog, and then at some point replaced with a cement dog. If you're local to the area, I'd love to hear your account on this. Most every source I've referenced seems to believe that Stiffy was indeed real. Let me know what story you heard of, or if you met old Stiffy in real life, or if you think this dog is named Stiffy, well, because he's made of cement, and has therefore always been a little bit stiff. Today, there is evidence of a footbridge in Charlestown, Indiana, just some struts near the edge of the Ohio River, and if you saw them, you'd probably think nothing of them. But they hark back to what was once a spot for recreation and family fun in the early to mid-20th century that was known as Rose Island. In short, Rose Island was an attraction for tourists opened in 1923 in Indiana that was in a location previously known as Fern Grove. It's worth noting, Rose Island is definitely not an island. It is rather a peninsula. But hey, Rose Island's name sounded a lot better to tourists, so they went with that. Additionally, this spot was not named Rose Island because of any real roses, rather it was named for the entrepreneur that purchased it, one David Rose, who built on this site a hotel, a swimming pool, and a wooden roller coaster for a sum of about $250,000. He even made a zoo here that held exotic animals ranging from wolves to monkeys to a bear named Teddy Roosevelt. If you can't already tell, the park was large. It was about 118 acres, and apparently Rose Island was doing well for a long time, and the main point of access to Rose Island was a suspended footbridge, or possibly a steamboat, that would take them to the shore of the peninsula from Louisville. It's worth noting, from some accounts I'm seeing, the footbridge sounded kind of sketchy. It was 50 feet above the creek below and easily rocked back and forth. Perhaps less scary was the steamboat that would take you from shore to shore for about 50 cents, from Louisville, Kentucky to Rose Island. It's recounted that this place was so popular that even throughout the Great Depression, the amusement park remained busy. But then, something happened. The Ohio River has been known to take casualties in this Weird Places series. If you remember Utopia, Ohio, some essentially cult members got a little too excited with the placement of their community, and it got washed away during a flood from the Ohio River. Here, I think old Mr. David Rose was a heck of a lot brighter than the Utopia cult, but sadly didn't place his bridge high enough to withstand the onslaught of the Ohio River flood of 1937, which didn't only damage the bridge, but also swallowed the whole amusement park in 10 feet of water. When the water receded, it was clear Rose Island was not repairable, and thus it was left behind. After this, Rose Island for a while was part of the Indiana Army Ammunition Plant's property, and after serving that purpose, it became part of Charlestown State Park. Today, you can still visit Rose Island, but there are very few signs left of what it once played host to. Among these remnants are the struts of a footbridge that I mentioned, the swimming pool on the property that is apparently in really good shape, and ruins of a stone fountain. The state of Indiana has actually built another footbridge to Rose Island to get over there for visitors of the park. Indiana, it has been a treat learning more about you, and I hope that I did your weird folklore justice. Again, if you want your state covered, tell me in the comments and upvote each other's recommendations. The loudest voices will win. Up at bat because of your comments are Wisconsin and North Carolina. Additionally, this is a surprise, we've got a special Christmas video coming out for you tomorrow, so turn on alerts so you don't miss it. Anyways, with this in mind, whether you just saw a man get out of the water covered in pond scum only to realize he wasn't a man at all, or someone looked at you dead in the eye and then called you a Hoosier before giving you a high five, don't you ever forget, it's always story time.